I believe we will make history tonight. I'm going to talk about the road to zero and why we are all now on that road and how we will move together to reach that goal. Today, world population is 7.2 billion people. By 2030, world population is expected to grow to about 8.3 billion people. That's an increase of 1.1 billion people. I'm sure you all know this, that by 2030, urban population is expected to grow by that 1.1 billion people. So all the growth, the entire growth estimate, will be absorbed by cities worldwide, both new and existing. We have a huge opportunity in the building sector. By 2030, over 80 billion square meters, that's 900 billion square feet, of new and tear down and rebuild buildings will be constructed in these urban areas worldwide. To give you an idea of what that number is, 80 billion square meters, that's an area equal to 60% of the entire building stock of the world that exists today. Or to put it another way, that's the equivalent of building a New York City, all 5 boroughs, every 35 days. If we get it right, we have an incredible opportunity to change the world. If we don't get it right, we lock in energy consumption and emissions patterns for 80 to about 120 years for infrastructure. So where is all this growth going to take place? I think you'll find this amazing. Countries on the bottom, about 4% we expect in Western Europe and other developed countries, moving over to India about 9%, and then other emerging countries about 12%, mostly Southeast Asia. This was surprising. The US and Canada will be responsible for 15% of all that construction in the next decade and a half, 2 decades. And of course, we all know about China. It'll be responsible for 38%. But the interesting statistic is that the world's 2 major polluters, North America and China, are responsible for 53% of all construction in the near-term future. We know where the emissions are coming from. 75% of all greenhouse gas emissions, human-produced, come from urban environments, from our cities. And we also know that in order to stay under 2 degrees centigrade planetary warming, and I'll tell you why this is critical, we must phase out CO2 emissions in the urban built environment by 2050. This is a graph that shows how much fossil fuel we burn. And the scientific community has made a number of projections. The first is business as usual. If we keep burning fossil fuels the way we've been burning them, and we do nothing to curb them and peak, then by 2100 we will have burned about 2 trillion tons of carbon. That's how much we would have put into the atmosphere. If we peak emissions by about 2080 and then begin to phase out carbon, we'll put close to 1.5 trillion, 1.4 trillion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. If we peak between 2040 and 2050 and then begin to phase out, this is global, we'll burn over 1 trillion tons of carbon. The fourth scenario was peaking in 2020 and then totally phasing out CO2 emissions in the built environment, in the power sector, in the built environment by 2070, 2080, we'll burn about 0.64 trillion tons of carbon. That scenario gives us a 66% chance of staying under 2 degrees centigrade. And what the scientific community has recently said is that that gives us a 33% chance of going over 2 degrees C, and that would be a disaster. So those odds are not good. And so they ran a 5th scenario, and that is peaking now or within the next few years, and then phasing out all CO2 in the built environment and in the power sector by about 2050. There's a 5 or 10-year leeway on either side of that. That gives us a high probability of staying under 2 degrees C. We burn about 500 billion tons of carbon, or 500 gigatons of carbon. That's what we have to shoot for. That's why the road to Z&E is critical. That's why you will make history at the end of this evening. What does that 2 degrees C mean? What is so magical about the 2 degrees C? Well, the first 3 scenarios that the scientific community ran, the planet passes the 2 degrees C point and keeps warming because there's so much carbon in the atmosphere and so much inertia, meaning that climate change is irreversible. The 4th scenario, by keeping global average temperature under 2 degrees C, the planet does not reach 2 degrees C and then begins to return back to pre-industrial climates, the one we've known for 11,000 years. And that's the track we must be on. The good news. The good news is Canada submitted their emissions targets to the UN about 2 weeks ago. And they call for a 30% target, 30% emissions reduction by the year 2030. It's a little less than most developed countries. Europe is 40%. The US is on track for about 35%, a little bit more. So it was a little bit of a disappointment, but it nevertheless is a target. British Columbia and Ontario joined California and 11 other states and provinces committing to an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by the year 2050. 80 to 95%, those are aggressive goals. That's the good news. The bad news is that no one thinks Canada is going to live up to its commitment because there is no control on oil sands and liquefied natural gas. Why is all that critical? I'm going to put this really in context, and then we'll get to the really interesting stuff. This is the 2 degrees C budget. That's the 530 gigatons or 0.5 or 500 billion tons of carbon. And you have gigatons on the bottom. So that's our total budget for staying under 2 degrees C. This is how much, from pre-industrial times to present, how much coal, oil, and gas we burned and how much CO2 and carbon we put into the atmosphere, 370 gigatons. So the difference between 370 and 530 is what we have left. If we burn more than that, we go over, and climate change becomes irreversible. So this is proven world reserves of unused fossil fuels. This is natural gas. If we burn all the natural gas, the conventional natural gas in the world, it'll take us right to the half a trillion tons of carbon, 530 gigatons. This is conventional oil. If we burn all the oil, conventional oil, we go slightly past that. So we can burn about, if we burn about half, a little less than half of each, we get to the 530. That's conventional. This is unconventional. This is shale and oil sands. Canada has about a third of that bar, owns about a third of that bar, which would take us just by itself to the limit. This is shale gas. This is how much reserves we have to burn. There is a lot of money in that bar. And this is how much coal reserves we have if we burn it all. So the key is that we can burn gas, we can burn oil, about half, and we've got to keep the rest in the ground. That's what the battle is about when we talk about oil sands. So what can we do? Why do I say we're going to make history tonight? In 2003, we discovered the building sector, and we published an article in Metropolis magazine. It was called the Architects Pollute article. It has now become a pretty well-known timeline, and it was like a dagger in the heart of an architect to tell them that they pollute, because their whole training is about making the world a better place. So to tell them they're responsible for the world's biggest crisis, they really didn't want to hear it for about 6 months, and then it drilled in, and then they got on board and started to do something about it. In 2006, we issued the 2030 targets, going to carbon neutral or zero carbon, or zero net energy, if you want to look at it that way, by 2030 for all buildings, all new buildings, major renovations. It was immediately adopted by the American Institute of Architects and the Mayors Association, and then right on the heels of that, the OAA, Ontario Association of Architects, and Royal Architectural Institute of Canada adopted it for their membership. Not everybody's doing it, but the memberships are now involved in getting there. So what are the statistics? Well, 70% of the top architecture engineering firms in the US and in North America have adopted the targets and are moving their practice to those goals. 54% of all US firms have adopted the targets and are moving to meet the targets. 63% of all US AE firms believe they can meet the target. They can get to carbon neutral by 2030. The federal government, for all federal buildings, by law, Section 433 of the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act, US, has by law mandated all federal buildings, new federal buildings and major renovations, will meet a zero fossil fuel standard by 2030. This is being challenged now in Congress by the American Gas Association, but it's still the law. California is going to zero residential buildings by 2020 and commercial buildings by the year 2030. And we've implemented with Canada an AIA plus 2030 and an OAA plus 2030 professional education series, and we've educated thousands of architects to date on how to meet these targets. And a new phenomenon sprang up, these 2030 districts going to 50 by 30, 50% reduction by 2030, beating the zero by 2050. And I'm happy to say that a few weeks ago, Toronto, the first Canadian district, formed and became part of the 2030 district movement. Just last week, Albuquerque then joined the movement, and we have now cities all across North America forming districts. What are 2030 districts? Well, 2030 districts are private sector led. This is not the government telling anyone what to do, local government, federal government. These are led by property owners and managers and building sector professionals who agree to adopt the targets in a large downtown urban district. They get together with service providers and stakeholders, those are utilities and others, and community stakeholders, different NGOs, and then they ask the local government if they want to join. These are incredibly powerful and wealthy private districts. And they commit to a 50% reduction in building energy consumption within the district by 2030, water consumption within the district by 2030, and transportation emissions within the district and into and out of the district. And we've just added a fourth metric because we know some warming is going to happen and there are impacts that we're beginning to see, and that is district resilience. So how do we get to Z&E? Well, we say it's a two-step process. Step one is information. We call this the no-cost, low-cost option. Knowing what you're doing, knowing how to design a building, knowing how to shade it, knowing how to orient it, knowing how to naturally ventilate it. All these things. If we do that, we can get 70 to 80% of the way to zero net energy. That's everything from where we locate buildings, transportation systems, walkable communities, vegetation, all the way down to buildings and building elements. If we know what we're doing, we could knock out 70 to 80% of the energy consumption and emissions of the built environment. Step two is we're going to need some electricity and some energy, and so that is technology, and that is everything from site scale renewables all the way up to large utility scale renewables like solar thermal, hydro, large scale wind. We have, at Architecture 2030, have gone out and scoured the building sector worldwide and looked at best practices and put that into a framework called the 2030 Pallet. Everything from large-scale development issues down through city-town issues, through districts, and then through site buildings and building elements. We've identified 53 different issues, and we've developed the activities to solve those issues. There'll be more coming, and this is an ongoing project at 2030. We've just done our first translation into Chinese. Spanish is on the way, it's almost there, and we'll publish that pretty soon. This is what's happened since 2006. We could not even talk about zero net energy 2 or 3 years ago. People would have thought we're crazy. Now every single conference is a Z&E conference. And now we're here talking about building lasting change, making history. So have we made any progress? Those are books, magazines, it's all over the place. You can't pick up a magazine without talking about LEED certification or a green building or a green roof or whatever. But has it translated into progress? I'll tell you the US case. This is quadrillion BTUs on the left-hand side. That's a unit of energy that we use in the US. It's different here, it's gigajoules and kilowatt hours per square meter, but just bear with me, it's just a number. And it rises on the left-hand side. On the bottom are years. In 2005, the US Energy Outlook projected, this is an arm of the DOE, Energy Information Administration, projected that by 2030, we would need 43% more energy to operate the building sector. So from 2005 to 23, we were going to have to build a huge number of power plants and gas and supply the building sector with about 43% more energy, almost a 45-degree curve. This is what happened in 2007. The projection came down, and we actually flatlined a little bit. In 2009, we actually went down, and the projection was not so steep. In 2011, we actually were level, we peaked, and we actually went down a bit, and we were only expected to go up a bit. In 2013, we went down even more in the building sector, and now the projections were even flat. And in 2015, we're expected to go down 2 quads and not even get back to 40 quads of energy until 2030 in business as usual. And we will have added 60 billion square feet to our building stock in the US between now and then, and we'll be using less energy than we used when we started this quest. That's due to better design better design, the GBCs, the AIAs, and the entire building sector. Manufacturers, contractors, ESCOs. We dropped down the equivalent of 620 500 megawatt power plants. That's how much we have saved. The good news is, and this is we're on track to do this actually, if we use the best available demand technology, this is not even the design stuff I talked about, the 70 to 80%. This is just demand technology, better glazing, better insulation, more efficient equipment, better lighting systems that are available off the shelf. We would then go down even further. And the fascinating news is in the US, we've saved the American consumer to date $560 billion in energy costs that they were projected to spend in 2005, from 2005 to 2013, that they did not spend. That was expendable income that they spend on their kids, on vacation, on housing, on rent, on food, on clothing. And that's how we got out of the recession in the US. And the projections are even more staggering. We're projected to spend $4.61 trillion less than we would have projected in 2005, and actually it's even more than that. It's another $1.83 trillion due to the building sector, which is why you're hearing now internationally a recognition that urban built environments and the building sector is key to getting a handle on climate change and energy consumption and fossil fuel use. And what's fascinating is, what no one thought was possible is that in the US, we've instituted a market-based moratorium on any new power plant capacity additions in the entire country out to 2025 in business as usual due to the building sector, not due to any mandates by the federal government or anyone else, just due to demand. There's a reduced demand now. And we're on track. We're actually running better than this. They call it a high demand technology. It's actually a low demand technology, meeting Energy Star for our housing. We're way past that now in the US, and we're way past the commercial targets that they projected here. We're actually on track for what they call the best available technology, and that is a huge reduction of power plant capacity supply in the US of 178 gigawatts. They are canceling plants all over the US. They might tear down one and build a replacement, but most of them are getting old, aging, and they're phasing them out and not rebuilding. We took that story to the UNFCCC in Bonn, and we presented this story. And we also presented a roadmap, a global roadmap to zero emissions for all countries. And we illustrated that it could be done. Immediately after that, the global architecture community adopted the 2050 phase out in the entire built environment of CO2 emissions. Since we presented that, the expectations for COP21, which is the climate conference in Paris in December, which we'll talk about in a minute. Since we issued the roadmap and we showed what could be done, the comment we got back is that you've given us the courage to take bold action. And since that time, this is what's happened. In Lima, over 120 countries call for zero fossil fuel emissions by mid-century or the second half of this century. Catholic bishops from every continent called for an end to the fossil fuel era, and Pope Francis will issue a climate change encyclical probably within the next 2 months. The head of the World Bank called for zero net emissions in the second part of this century. The head of the OECD called for zero emissions. The USDN, of which Vancouver is part of, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance pledged zero or near zero greenhouse gas emissions for these cities by 2050, and the EU submitted its target to the UN, a 40% interim reduction in the whole EU by 2030 and an 80 to 85% emissions reduction by 2050. And the mayor of New York City during Climate Week came out and called for New York committing to an 80% by 2050 reduction. We developed a plan, were asked to develop a plan for New York City and present it to the mayor before that. And we did. It was called the Urban Climate Initiative. And it was a roadmap for reaching zero in the urban built environment by the year 2050. And this is the fascinating part. We call for upgrading the building codes, getting to a Z&E building code by 2030. So we wanted them to update their codes in New York, get to a Z&E code, zero net energy code by 2030 in increments, all the way out to 2030. And then we gave them intervention points on when to implement the code. So the code would be implemented for all new buildings, for major renovations, but we couldn't get there with just those two. Couldn't get to the phase out. And then we discovered a fantastic, interesting statistic. Building purchases. On building purchase, within a year after purchase, we asked the city to implement the code. Why is this critical? Because there's enough turnover of building purchases of the entire existing building stock in New York by 2050. And that's how you get the deep renovations. And why at building purchase? Because you overcome the economic condition and financing that usually hampers renovations. At that time, a huge, if you know the prices in New York City, a huge amount of money changes hands. There's new financing available to purchase the buildings. And so adding a little bit on top of that for deep efficiency reductions is a no-brainer and is easy to do. And second, you usually have a turnover of occupancy. So the people coming in are usually renovating anyway. And so we ask them to renovate on top of that. But we give them an out. If you're buying it, for example, just as an investment, and you're not going to move people out to do the deep renovations, we say purchase renewable energy within the metropolitan area, and then you create the market for solar and wind within that area and get the jobs and keep the jobs there. And so that's how we create the market for renewable energy applications. So now, we ran the numbers for New York. We're going back in a few days to actually give them the actual numbers, and they look like this. By 2050, New York will reduce emissions in the building sector by 91%. They'll generate $5.8 billion worth of construction annually. That'll lead to 65,000 new jobs in New York every year. The city will reap about $500 million in taxes from all that construction. And the key number here is they'll add 45 million square feet of new building, but in purchases, it's 134 million square feet of renovation. And that's how they get the reductions. So, we looked at Vancouver. We understand Vancouver's having a hard time with their existing building stock. And so what we wanted to do was see how this would play out in Vancouver. The baseline in Vancouver is ASHRAE 90.1, 1989. That's benchmark at 100. The building code that's in place today is 90.1, 2010, or NECB 2011. It's about a 35% reduction. So if you built a code today in Vancouver, you're at about a 35% reduction below the benchmark. And so what we say is develop a 50% code in 2017 and implement it, develop a 70% code, it's called the Carbon Neutral Ready Code, and implement it by 2020. And then next year, you have a green rezoning, which is a 50% code, reduction code. Keep those as stretch codes and incentivize them, incentivize people to do better than code. And then in 2017, the 50% code becomes the code, the 70% code then is the stretch code, you incentivize that, and then by 2020, you have a carbon neutral ready code. And we say do that for all new buildings and building sales. And I finally, last night at about 2 in the morning, got some numbers for the residential sector in Vancouver and the greater metro area. And if you, at building sale, require deep renovations, you will renovate the entire building, residential building stock in this area by the year 2050. And we say for residential areas, use EnerGuide, and we went from 60 down to 100. It goes from 0 to 100, 100 being Z&E. The average home is 66. And if you build to code today, you're building at about 72. And we say in 2016, use EnerGuide 80 as the standard. In 2018, use EnerGuide 90. And in 2020, use EnerGuide 100 as the code. And then put the stretch codes in place with incentives. So now to ask, how are we going to make history? Well, the world is getting together in Paris in December, end of November, December, at the end of this year. And countries are putting together their emissions. So the climate summit will be a success of sorts. It probably won't get us all the way below 2 degrees centigrade, but it'll be a success, and then they'll revisit it every year or two and put pressure on countries to reduce emissions. They have acknowledged in Paris to us and the WGBC and other organizations that the building sector is critical, the private building sector is critical in getting the reduction targets and helping the cities and helping the states and provinces and helping the governments to make their emissions targets and actually do better. And so they're going to give us a full day if we bring commitments to the table in Paris. So how do we on Buildings Day? We have a whole day. The world will be watching. We have a whole day. So there are a number of things we need to do, but this is a key element of it. We need to add a green building certification level that is Z&E. And so, what we say is that we can have a LEED Platinum plus Z&E level. So in the energy part of LEED Platinum, there's a Z&E pathway. If you meet that pathway, you meet LEED Platinum Z&E. BEAM, which is in Hong Kong, which is another GBC, they have BEAM plus Platinum, Z&E certification. BREEAM in Europe, they have an outstanding level, outstanding plus Z&E rating. Green Star plus Z&E, Australia. 4 Green Globes on the eastern part of Canada, 4 Green Globes plus Z&E. 6 Star, a 6 Star plus Z&E in South Africa. HQE in France, and HQE Z&E rating, certification. 5 Pearls plus Z&E in the Middle East. DGNB Gold in Germany, a G&E Gold plus Z&E certification. So, a few minutes ago, I got on the phone with Rick Fedrizzi, and I said, this is what we're going to present tonight. This is how we're going to make history tonight. And so we wrote out a joint statement. So this is what we wrote out. I just talked with Rick Fedrizzi, and we jointly committed to work together to encourage all LEED Platinum buildings, both existing and new, those coming down the pike, to take steps necessary to reach zero net energy. And we're calling on the GBCs and the other certification institutions all around the world to follow that lead, to work with us to get those designations. Why? If there's a Z&E designation, that is a marker in the marketplace that that is where we're headed, and then everyone begins to move in that direction. Once you put it out there, there's no taking it back, and the marketplace will respond. And that is the only way we're going to move fast enough. So if we make a commitment to do that tonight and work toward that, then we have a great opportunity of getting there and making Paris a success. Whoa, let me go back. So if anybody's tweeting out today, this is what my staff told me to say. Put hashtag plus Z&E on your tweets or Facebook or whatever if you're going to talk about this and begin to move this out so we can keep track of what's going on. To finish up, why am I hopeful? Not only will you make history tonight, but certain things are happening out there. The stars are aligning. This is from 1980 to 2010. This is the cost of fossil fuels that we paid, and it's adjusted for inflation. So from 1980 to 2000 to today, 2015, the cost of fossil fuels, if you adjust it for inflation, has been flat, the same. It's running about $50 to $75 a gigajoule. Now I'm going to put in motion the cost of generating electricity, clean electricity, solar electricity. In 1980, to generate the same amount of electricity was $1,100 a gigajoule, as opposed to $50 to $75. And we still tried some of it, and we had all sorts of experiments and stuff like that. I'm going to put in motion what's happened from that time to today. This is the cost of generating electricity with solar. And that is not going to bounce back up. That's going to keep going in that direction. And now, the other piece of the puzzle is storage. And now that's beginning to happen because that has crossed the line. That's the next piece of the puzzle. And so history was made a few years ago, and we've got to keep that going, and that's what this meeting is about. In 2000, about 81% of all the additional power capacity in the world was non-renewables. In 2012, 2013, the lines crossed, and now of additional capacity, additional energy that the world needs, more of it is being generated by renewables than by fossil fuels and nuclear combined. And that pathway is going to keep going. It is not bouncing back. And that's the hope. Thank you very much. Let's go out and make history.